There was a time when one man defined an entire decade without even trying. White suit, no socks, a speedboat, and a voice that sounded like it had been marinated in cigarettes and confidence. That man was Don Johnson, and for a stretch in the 1980s, he was arguably the most recognizable face on American television. But fame like that rarely comes without a price tag, and Don's bill arrived in the form of foreclosure notices, international scandal, and a decades-long fight just to hang on to the fortune he built. Today, at 75, he's still standing, still working, and still turning up in major films. So how exactly did a kid from rural Missouri become a global icon, lose a small fortune along the way, and somehow come out the other side intact? That's the story worth telling. It's worth pausing on just how total that 1980s takeover really was before we get into how it all nearly slipped away. This wasn't a case of a talented actor landing a hit show and quietly cashing checks in the background. Johnson became a genuine cultural phenomenon, the kind of celebrity whose personal style, the linen jackets over T-shirts, the sockless loafers, the stubble that never quite turned into a beard, got copied by men who'd never even seen the show. He dated some of the most famous women in the world, counted actors like Jack Nicholson among his close friends, and moved through Hollywood at a level that very few actors, then or now, ever actually reach. And that's exactly what makes the years that followed so jarring. Because behind the tailored suits and the magazine covers, Johnson was quietly building the kind of financial and personal mess that would take him decades to climb out of. Long before the pastel blazers and the Ferrari, Don Wayne Johnson was born on December 15th, 1949, in the tiny community of Flat Creek, Missouri. His mother was only 16 and his father just 19 when he arrived, and the family soon relocated to Wichita, Kansas, where his father took a job with Boeing. Johnson has described his upbringing in blunt terms over the years, calling it chaotic and emotionally difficult, with parents who were often absent, overworked, and under strain. It wasn't the kind of childhood that predicts a life in the spotlight. There was no showbiz pedigree, no connections, nothing handed to him. What he did have was restlessness, a quick temper, and, as it turned out, real talent the moment he stepped in front of an audience. That talent surfaced almost by accident. In high school, Johnson needed extra credit and ended up in a drama class, where a teacher noticed something in him worth developing. He landed a role in a school production and found, for maybe the first time, a place where his energy actually worked in his favor instead of against him. That spark carried him to the University of Kansas on a partial scholarship, where he studied theater before eventually training at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, one of the more respected programs of its kind. From there, the path to Hollywood wasn't instant. It was slow, uneven, and full of the kind of rejection that quietly ends most acting careers before they start. Throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Johnson worked the margins of the industry. Small theater gigs, minor television appearances, a handful of low-budget films. One of the more notable early credits was a strange, post-apocalyptic picture called A Boy and His Dog, which developed a cult following but did little to make him a household name. For more than a decade, Johnson was the definition of a working actor who hadn't quite broken through. Then, in 1984, everything changed at once. That year, NBC premiered a stylish new cop show built around two Miami detectives working undercover in a world of yachts, cocaine, and neon-lit nightlife. Miami Vice turned Johnson, playing Detective James Sonny Crockett, into an overnight sensation, even though he'd already been grinding for the business for 15 years. The show didn't just find an audience. It reshaped how television looked and sounded. Pastel jackets over T-shirts, no socks with loafers, a soundtrack built around contemporary pop and rock instead of orchestral scores. Suddenly, menswear stores across the country were stocking linen blazers because of a television detective. Johnson became less an actor and more a walking style guide, appearing on magazine covers and in music videos, his face inseparable from the aesthetic of an entire decade. Part of what made Miami Vice so different was its refusal to look or sound like anything else on television at the time. Instead of traditional orchestral score, the show leaned on contemporary pop and rock tracks, turning entire episodes into something closer to an extended music video, which was still a fairly new art form in 1984. Directors were given real budgets to shoot on location, chase boats through Biscayne Bay, and light nightclub scenes like feature films rather than procedural cop dramas. Johnson, as Crockett, became the human embodiment of that entire aesthetic shift, and the show's popularity meant he was rarely out of the public eye. He appeared on late-night talk shows, sat for cover stories in major magazines, and became one of the most photographed men in the country almost overnight, an especially strange transition for someone who had spent the previous 15 years struggling to land steady work. The money followed quickly. By the height of the show's run, Johnson was earning a substantial six-figure salary per episode, an enormous sum for network television at the time, and the show ran for 5 seasons. He didn't stop at acting. In 1986, riding the wave of his sudden stardom, he released a pop album called Heartbeat, and the title track climbed the Billboard charts and became a genuine hit, an unusual crossover for a television actor. He recorded duets, performed live, and generally proved that in the mid-1980s, if your name was Don Johnson, doors opened that stayed shut for almost everyone else. He bought property, built a serious car collection, and ran in social circles that included some of the biggest names in Hollywood. His personal life during this period was just as headline-worthy as his career, and arguably more complicated. Johnson has been married multiple times. 2 of his earliest marriages, when he was very young, were brief and quickly annulled. Far more significant was his relationship with actress Melanie Griffith, whom he met on a film set in the early 1970s when she was still a teenager and he was in his mid-20s, an age gap that raised eyebrows even then. They married in January 1976 and divorced by the end of that same year. It would have been a strange footnote in most people's lives, except that more than a decade later, in 1989, Johnson and Griffith remarried. That second run together produced a daughter, Dakota Johnson, who would go on to build her own major acting career. This second marriage lasted until 1996, when the couple divorced again, this time for good, though they remained connected over the years as co-parents and have spoken publicly at different points about the deep and complicated bond they shared. Beyond Griffith, Johnson's romantic life reads like a tour of Hollywood itself. He was in a long relationship with actress and model Patty D'Arbanville in the early 1980s, and the couple had a son together, Jesse Johnson, without ever marrying. He was linked publicly to Barbra Streisand in the late 1980s, a pairing that made plenty of headlines given both of their profiles at the time. He also dated actress Jodie Lynn O'Keefe, his co-star on Nash Bridges, a relationship that drew criticism due to the significant age difference between them. It wasn't until 1999 that Johnson's personal life settled into something steadier. He married Kelly Flager, a former teacher with no ties to the entertainment industry, and that marriage has lasted for well over 2 decades, producing 3 children and, by most accounts, giving Johnson stability his earlier decades had lacked. Friends and colleagues who worked with Johnson before and after that marriage have noted a visible shift in him, describing someone who traded the constant churn of tabloid romances for something considerably quieter, a family life built largely away from the cameras that followed his earlier relationships so closely. It's a strange arc when you lay it all out. A man who spent his 20s, 30s, and much of his 40s bouncing between short marriages, public breakups, and relationships that generated headlines purely because of who he was dating, eventually settling into the longest and most stable relationship of his life once the spotlight had dimmed just slightly. Dakota Johnson, the product of his second marriage to Griffith, has spoken publicly over the years about growing up with famous parents who divorced twice, describing a childhood that was loving but undeniably unconventional. Jesse Johnson, his son with Patty D'Arbanville, followed his father into acting as well, taking on smaller roles across film and television while largely avoiding the level of scrutiny his father and half-sister have experienced. Fame at the level Johnson experienced in the 1980s came wrapped in temptation, and he wasn't immune to it. He has spoken candidly in later interviews about the drinking that became part of his daily life during and after Miami Vice, describing Hollywood in that era as a place where heavy substance use was less an exception than an expectation. What started as a way to unwind after long shooting days gradually became something heavier, and by the early 1990s, it was effective behavior in ways that became public. One widely reported incident involved a combative, alcohol-fueled radio interview in which Johnson lashed out at the hosts, an episode that embarrassed him and, by his own later admission, served as part of a wake-up call. He eventually sought treatment, and while he's kept many specifics of that period private, He has openly credited getting sober with saving both his career and his relationships going forward. Even as the drinking became a serious problem, his career didn't immediately collapse. In 1996, he launched a second hit series, Nash Bridges, playing a San Francisco police inspector, and the show ran successfully for 6 seasons on CBS. It's a detail worth sitting with, because it shows how differently addiction can play out from the outside compared to the inside, to the public. Johnson looked like a man who had successfully transitioned from one hit show to another, proof that his 1980 stardom hadn't been a fluke. Behind the scenes, according to his own later comments, he was managing a drinking problem that had been building for years, the kind of thing that rarely announces itself all at once, but instead erodes a person's life gradually, one missed responsibility and one strained relationship at a time. Getting sober, by his own account, wasn't a single dramatic moment, so much as a slow recognition that the version of himself the public loved was becoming harder and harder to maintain off camera. If addiction was the quiet crisis of Johnson's life, the strange episode that unfolded in November 2002 was the loud one. While crossing from Switzerland into Germany, Johnson's car was stopped for a routine customs check. Inside was a briefcase containing financial documents, credit notes, and certificates that customs officials valued at an almost unbelievable $8 billion. German authorities were stunned, and word quickly reached the press that Johnson was being looked at in connection with a possible money laundering investigation. For weeks, tabloids around the world ran with the story, some suggesting Johnson was secretly entangled in an international financial scheme far bigger than anything his public image suggested. Johnson maintained from the very beginning that the documents weren't his. According to his account, later repeated on Larry King Live, he had been traveling with associates involved in financing a film project, and the paperwork belonged to investors, not to him personally. German officials eventually confirmed that no offense had been committed and closed the matter without charges, with a customs spokesman even expressing regret that the story had leaked to the press and caused Johnson so much trouble. Vindicated or not, the damage to his reputation and business relationships had already been done. By his own account, the episode cost him real money, as banks reportedly closed accounts linked to him and investors got cold feet on projects already in motion, simply because his name had been connected, however unfairly, to the words money laundering. The financial pressure that had been building for years came to a genuine crisis point 2 years later. Johnson had long owned a sprawling ranch property in Woody Creek, near Aspen, Colorado, a 17-acre state that had become one of his most prized possessions. In 2004, 2 of Johnson's companies, which held the property, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection and subsequently took out a loan of roughly $10.6 million from a New York-based lender to help them emerge from that bankruptcy. When payment on that loan fell behind, the lender moved to foreclose, and by April 2006 the situation had become genuinely dire. Court documents show that 14 acres of the estate were scheduled to be auctioned on the courthouse steps in Aspen, with the remaining 3 acres and guest house set to go under the hammer just weeks later. Johnson made the deadline with hours to spare, wiring roughly $14.5 million. Funds he'd secured to the sale of a separate property to satisfy the debt and stop the auction. Public records from that same period also revealed a string of smaller, almost embarrassing debts, including an unpaid grocery bill and outstanding balances owed to a local hospital and law firm, all of which painted a picture of a man whose lifestyle had, for a period, badly outpaced his cash flow. Johnson later went on the offensive, suing the lender itself in federal court, alleging unlawful lending practices, in what became just one more chapter in a long and messy legal saga tied to that property. Around the same period, Johnson found himself in a separate, much larger legal battle, this one over unpaid earnings from Nash Bridges. In 2009, his production company sued Risher Entertainment, the company behind the show, arguing that his original 1995 contract entitled him to a 50% copyright stake in the series once it passed 66 episodes, a milestone Nash Bridges cleared easily over its 6-season run. Risher argued the show had never actually turned a profit once production and distribution costs were factored in. In the summer of 2010, after a 2-week trial, a jury sided decisively with Johnson, awarding him $23.2 million in damages and confirming He was a 50% copyright owner of the show, a highly unusual arrangement for a television actor to have negotiated in the first place. One of Johnson's own attorneys testified during the trial that in more than 3 decades of representing talent in the entertainment industry, he had never negotiated another television contract that granted an actor outright copyright ownership of the show he starred in, which underscored just how unusual and valuable Johnson's original 1995 deal had been. A judge later added tens of millions more in prejudgment interest, briefly pushing the total award north of $50 million, though much of that additional amount was eventually reversed on appeal after court found the jury had improperly calculated the interest period. After further legal wrangling that dragged on for years, including additional appeals and even a separate later lawsuit between Risher and one of its own former corporate owners, Ova was actually on the hook for the debt. The case ultimately settled in 2013 with Risher paying Johnson $19 million, closing out one of the longer-running profit disputes in television history, and finally putting real money back in Johnson's pocket after a genuinely rough financial decade. By the time Johnson reached his 60s, the kind of leading man offers that once defined his career had slowed to a trickle, which is simply the reality most actors face once they age out of the industry's narrow definition of a romantic lead. Rather than disappearing, though, Johnson recalibrated. He shifted into character work and supporting roles that leaned on his history rather than fighting it, turning up in television comedies like Eastbound and Down, playing supporting parts in major films, including Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, and later appearing in Rian Johnson's ensemble mystery Knives Out. Around the same period, he also stepped back into television with a recurring role on the legal drama Blood and Oil and made appearances across a string of other series, quietly stacking up credits in a way that kept him working steadily rather than chasing another Miami Vice-sized hit. In more recent years, he's continued working steadily, including a role in the 2024 Netflix thriller Rebel Ridge, which introduced him to a wave of younger viewers who likely have no memory of Miami Vice's original run, and who probably know him more as a respected character actor than as the pastel-suited heartthrob who once defined an entire decade. It's the kind of second act that plenty of 1980s stars never managed to pull off, and it says something about Johnson's staying power that, 5 decades into his career, he's still being cast in high-profile projects rather than trading